everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk a bit more about our preamp and also the measuring of distortion, THD, on the new Quant Asylum distortion analyzer that Ron has purchased, and all these figures are related to. First of all, when you're measuring distortion of a preamp or anything for that matter, you have to be conscious of the fact that the distortion analyzer itself has distortion. Clearly, if you're trying to measure the very low distortion that our preamp has, you have to take into consideration the amount of distortion that the Quant Asylum self-generates, because you can get to the stage where it's almost impossible to measure the distortion because the distortion analyzer has relatively high distortion levels itself. Now, you can get around this problem. You can spend $50,000 on some of the really expensive pieces of equipment that has distortion internally somewhat lower. But unfortunately, we're only both poor pensioners and our budgets don't stretch to such pieces of equipment. We have to make do with what we can, and in this case it's the FCA-001A from Quant Asylum, which has basically got quite a good reputation amongst reviewers and designers alike, and certainly it is sufficiently good that we can demonstrate how good our preamp actually is, and I'm going to show you some of these things live on this channel today. Something to consider about the Quant Asylum is its distortion. The distortion of our preamp is actually 0.00016%. That figure includes the distortion of the distortion analyzer. I'm going to show you a couple more slides taken from the preamp, and one of them shows the crosstalk. And for those of you that don't fully understand what that means, is what you do, you feed in a tone, usually 1 kilohertz, you feed it into one channel at a certain level. In this case it's 1 volt, and you look at the output of the other channel, and the idea is that there should be no signal bleeding over onto the other channel, hence crosstalk. And you'll see on this slide that there is no 1 kilohertz signal present that you can visually see or visually measure, and you'll see the crosstalk is basically just noise. The reason the noise shows up more than it would do normally is because the second channel input is open circuit, and it's just open to all the muck and stuff in the air. So it's worst case syndrome. You're putting in a very high tone in level on one channel, and if there was crosstalk, you would see remnants of that 1 kilohertz, be it very low down. But the point of this is you can't see any. But that's what you'd expect from the design, which is basically 2 mono blocks. This next graph shows frequency response, and ironically I have to say that the Quant Asylum isn't good enough to measure the frequency response of this preamp because of its digital to analog output. It can't measure frequencies much above 22 kilohertz. So that's why the line you're seeing on this graph is a straight line. The frequency response of the preamp is about 3 hertz to 160 kilohertz, about a quarter of a dB down. Now I have in fact shown this on previous videos, so I won't repeat it again. It just goes to show that you buy an expensive piece of kit and it can only display basically 20 hertz to 21, 22 kilohertz. And of course, it just shows up as a straight line. I suppose it can be considered to be the audible part, 20 to 20k. It's time now to have a bit of a discussion as to why we've made the THD on this preamp so low. You often hear people say, oh, more than 0.1% distortion is inaudible. Many moons ago, in fact in the middle 50s, Peter Walker, the founder member of Quad and the electrostatic speaker and products like that, made a big thing in wireless world by saying a good amplifier, preamp or power amplifier, should be basically a piece of wire with gain. I've always remembered that. If you ask yourself what hi-fi is, it should be whatever you feed into the input, it amplifies it and puts it out at a level that you can hear in a loudspeaker or headphones exactly as it went in. The idea of low THD is simply that. It's as nearest thing to a straight line as possible. If you can make an amplifier with 4 noughts, 1% or something like that THD, why would you want anything other than that, is my question. A valve amplifier, for example, that some people say is warm, pleasant, and makes everything sound awfully nice. And it does that by adding huge amounts of predominantly second and third harmonic distortion, which some people will say makes the amplifier sound pleasant. Well, I'm not going to say that is wrong, but in the terms of a hi-fi product, it is very wrong, because what you're putting in isn't what's coming out. You've added loads of other stuff. You may well prefer the added stuff, and this video is not to judge people that do, but it isn't hi-fi. It's not. Let me give you an example of what I'm getting at. Say you have a pretty average or poor recording. It's a little harsh and it's a little bit distorted in places. Many recordings sadly are like this. If you feed it into a preamp or an amplifier that has high THD, what you do, you end up losing some of that detail that's in the original recording. It could be horrible material, but it tends to filter that out. So the argument goes, a quite poor recording will sound better. And that's because you've filtered out and added extra harmonics which please you. Now, this isn't a judgment if that's what you want, but equally the opposite is true. If you have a high quality recording and you listen to that with the added THD and all that, it will still sound pleasant, and it might even sound slightly better than the original to your ears. Let's look at the opposite. You've got our preamp and you've got a poor recording going into it. What comes out will be an equally poor recording, and in fact it could sound worse because you're not adding any nice harmonics to it, but because there's so much detail in the preamp, you're almost emphasizing the poorness, if that's even a proper word. So I understand when some people say, oh, I don't want to hear all that, I want it all to sound nice. Okay, that's the, if you like, the downside of a quality preamp. But let's say you've just gone out and you've bought the best recording. I mean, you couldn't make it better. All the mics are in the right position. The sun's in the right part of the sky. Everything is wonderful on this recording. When you feed that into our preamp, it will come out exactly the same, except you will be able to extract more detail, little tiny sounds that you've not heard before. And once you're used to a preamp that does that, you will never go back to one with high THD or valves. You won't. I mean, it's like anything else. Do you remember when you were younger? For me, it's a long time ago, but to me then, if I was listening to pop music of its day, it couldn't have enough bass on it. The bass control would be on full, and that's the way most people start off with hi-fi. They want tone controls, they want extra boost, loudness controls, because it all makes it sound so much better than the old record player that you had sitting in the corner. And that was people's first journey into hi-fi, including myself. I'm not saying, but many people have been there. You'll find that as time goes on, the bass control won't be on full. You'll gradually inch it back, and then you'll begin to hear sounds that you've never heard before because it's been swamped out by all the bass, or if you like, extra harmonics, because bass lift is basically coloration of the sound. It's not on the original. Let's have a chat now about the preamp itself. I would urge you to watch the previous 2 or 3, I can't remember how many I've made now. I've got some kind of sad news. We did hope at one stage to be able to produce this as a kit or a finished product rather than just the board. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to do the latter. So for the moment, we will only be offering the printed circuit board. The problem basically is getting the components put together. If you source them from China, we don't know what the origin of the components are. And it goes back to the idea that if you build or assemble this board and take care in assembly, you will get exactly the same results because there's no magic in this particular preamp assembly. None of the components are particularly rare. They're all readily available from the likes of Mauser, Farnell, DigiKey and the likes, and I would urge you to purchase, if you can in your country, the components from such a company. Most important are the ICs, whether you choose to use the LME, which does give marginally better performance than the 5532. Distortion doesn't change, ironically. We've tested them both. Frequency response doesn't change. The only difference in reality is that the LME has a faster rise and fall time. So it gives you that small degree of extra detail. But saying that, if you want to have the sound slightly, very slightly more towards the valve sound, if I dare to even say that, use a 5532. But the best advice I can give you is to buy the LME and also the 553, because the 5532 is pennies, even for an authentic version. So buy them both and don't keep swapping them backwards and forwards, but listen for 3 or 4 days on material that you know, and then swap the IC and listen again, and you will soon know which one suits you. But please don't think it's chalk and cheese. You're not going to listen and think, oh, that's terrible, and put another IC in, oh, perfect. It's not like that. It's very subtle, and on some material you'll find it impossible to tell the difference. Only the PCB is available, and at the time of recording this video, we just have another 100, I think it's either 110 or 120 boards in stock. So if you want to order them, go ahead. Now, a point about ordering them. They are dispatched from America. The boards are made in China. The link that's in the description is a direct link to Ron's eBay account. So you can buy, this would be one of the few things that you can buy on eBay where you know the source, you know everything about it. You've seen the video. I haven't written a book yet, but you know Ron from past videos, so you can honestly purchase the board in complete safety. We've sold over 260 boards so far, and as I said, there's another 100, I think he said it, Ron told me it was 100. It's either 100 or 120 boards have now come back into stock. So get your credit card out and off you go. The good news also is the fact that for the last 3 weeks we have been able to supply worldwide. There's still a couple of countries that we can't supply to you, but this is an eBay thing, nothing to do with us. We've never restricted where we supply the boards to, but as we were a new account to eBay, they placed restrictions on us, basically to protect you, because I mean, you know, we're honest people, but eBay doesn't know that, but they do know now. And if you look in there, we've had 100% positive feedback. Just before I go, 1 or 2 people have asked whether we are producing a power amplifier. The answer is very simple. Don't tell Ron I've told you, but